Now, political chaos continues in Britain, of course, as Boris Johnson's Brexit deadline approaches at the end of next month. What will happen next? No one really knows. A few minutes ago, I caught up with our good friend Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked Online, and I started off by asking him about the climate protests, which, of course, happened across the UK as well. What's your take on the climate strike for global action? Of course, we saw it here in Australia, and then it has occurred right around the world. Is there any substance in these protests, or is it all about just gestures, I suppose, pleas for attention?
I think it's a form of hysteria. I think if you look at what some of these kids and other adults are saying, it's completely nuts. I mean, they talk about the end of the world. They say that Africa is on fire. One of the leaflets they were giving out at the strike in London said that Africa is on fire, which is complete and utter fake news. Africa is not on fire. They say the Amazon is disappearing. We won't be able to breathe in 20 years' time. The whole world will be flooded. I mean, it really is hysterical stuff. It has no basis in science whatsoever. They talk about science all the time, but actually what they're really pushing is this kind of millenarian end-of-world view, and I just think it's incredibly damaging, it's incredibly dangerous, and what we really have are all these indoctrinated kids who've been screwed up by adults, traipsing through the streets preaching about the end of the world. That is not a healthy situation for society to be in.
Yeah, this alarmism is really a worry. I mean, I take global action on climate change seriously. It's a policy issue, an economic issue and scientific issue that grown-ups ought to be able to discuss and try and tackle, but we just have rampant alarmism. You mentioned Africa being on fire. One minute they were telling us the Amazon was on fire. They're also saying the Arctic is on fire, referring, of course, to bushfires they have in Siberia every year. The concern with this alarmism, I think, is that so many in the political world and the media world fail to fact-check it, fail to put any scrutiny on it. They just actually amplify it.
Absolutely, and I agree with you. You know, looking after the environment is a good thing. Everyone wants to live in a nice environment. Everyone wants clean air. Everyone wants to have, you know, nice parts of nature that we can visit. Everyone, I think, is in favour of that. But I think actually this kind of hysterical alarmism gets in the way of ensuring that we can create that kind of world, because its entire emphasis is on the wickedness of mankind and how destructive we are. And one of the speakers at the climate strike in London said that big business is murdering the human species. And when you hear language like that, you really do realise that they have lost the plot. This is not a scientifically based movement anymore. This is not a rational movement. This has become a kind of religious cult which wants humankind to self-flagellate for daring to pursue modernity and progress. So I think it's becoming like a religious cult, and of course now they have their messiah figure in the shape of Saint Greta Thunberg, and I think all of that is incredibly unhealthy, and it's terrifying the next generation of children who now live in a state of constant fear.
Where do we get the corrective to this? How do we get the debate to return back to facts and objectivity? How do we get a political debate and education, I suppose, in the classrooms, just to look at dealing with this issue the way we would deal with so many other difficult issues on this planet?
That's right. I think, you know, teaching kids about the climate, teaching kids about geography and about the impact that mankind has undoubtedly had, that's all very good. I think that should be part of the curriculum in schools. But what is currently happening in schools is that kids are being pumped with a politics of fear. They're being fed this narrative of fear. It's reminiscent of in the 1980s when, you know, kids of my generation would be told that there could be a nuclear holocaust. The only thing that will survive are cockroaches. Everyone's going to die. It will be really horrible and painful. And there was this attempt to whip up a real state of fear among our generation. It didn't quite work. People were quite sceptical and quite cynical, and we could see that the world was moving actually in a quite different direction. But I think the new culture of fear being pumped into kids in schools is having an impact, and we are seeing the rise of a new mental malaise called eco-anxiety, which according to reports is growing and growing, and I don't think that's very surprising. If you constantly tell kids that the world is coming to an end, they will become anxious and fearful.
Well, you've even got young adults now saying that they're not going to have children because the planet is so threatened. It is really nuts, and we're dealing with that across the world, of course. But what you're also dealing with in the UK, of course, is Brexit. I've been loving your commentary on what's happening with Brexit. You're about 6 weeks away now from the final deadline at the end of October, when Brexit must happen, according to Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Dare we believe this? Dare we believe that Brexit will actually happen in accordance with the will of the British people?
I can't see it myself. I mean, Boris has said it has to be the 31st of October, do or die, we're going to leave on that date. But, you know, virtually the entire political establishment is absolutely determined to ensure that Brexit doesn't happen. They're doing everything they can. They are using Parliament as a weapon against the vote of 2016, with all these MPs constantly arguing that we should ignore the vote or override it with a second referendum, or dilute it to such an extent that it wouldn't really be Brexit at all. It would just be Brexit in name only. Some of them are now using the law courts, and they are pursuing legal cases against Boris Johnson in order to thwart his any attempt by him to get a Brexit deal. So, you know, lots of us, when we voted to leave the European Union in 2016, lots of us felt that it wouldn't be allowed to happen. We saw from experience, whenever European people have voted against the European Union, including in Ireland, in the Netherlands, in France, in Greece, they've either been forced to vote again, or their vote has simply been ignored. So lots of us suspected Brexit wouldn't be allowed. They wouldn't permit it. But even I am surprised at the lengths to which the political class is going in order to stop Brexit. I mean, they are working on this tirelessly. They have devoted themselves to ensuring that the largest democratic vote in the history of this country doesn't happen, and that's pretty terrifying.
So what will happen? Are we looking at more delay? Are we looking at a general election? I know it's enormously difficult to predict, but what's your best estimate?
I think there will be a delay. I think MPs in Parliament are pretty adamant that there needs to be a delay and that there needs to be an extension of the process. There will be a general election soon. MPs have voted twice against holding a general election. Boris said, let's have an election, and they voted against it because they're so scared of the people's judgment. They know that ordinary people are seething and furious that so many members of Parliament have used their positions of power to thwart the largest vote in the history of this country. So there will be a general election, and I think it will be like a second referendum. People will use the general election to express their fury at the Remainer elite for having been so arrogant in the way in which it's stitched up the vote for Brexit. So the one thing that can be said about British politics is that it is incredibly unpredictable at the moment. It's very exciting. It's been turned completely upside down by voters who voted for Brexit, and it's opened up all sorts of new debates and arguments which we hadn't had for years and years. So even though things are very confusing here, they are also very exciting.
Yeah, you and I have talked often about how the political media class has become increasingly disengaged and even disdainful of mainstream voters in our Western liberal democracies. I notice a former Labor MP, Ian Austin, has set up a new organisation in the UK called Mainstream. And he's looking at a breakaway party. He's sick of the extreme left and the extreme right, and he wants to give the mainstream a voice, at least in principle. It's an area ripe for picking, isn't it?
I think so, and particularly, you know, one of the problems in the Labour Party here is that it has been colonised by these kind of woke leftists. You know, they present themselves as Marxists in the old style, but actually they are just incredibly painfully PC. They're very woke. They're very, very intolerant of anyone who holds a different point of view to theirs. There's an undercurrent of anti-Semitism in this woke left movement, which is deeply concerning. And they have pushed a new kind of extremism into British politics, not an old left extremism. I think it's something quite different and in some ways a little bit worse. It's this extremism which says anyone who disagrees with us is an evil person and ought to be no platformed or silenced or hounded out of public life. And they are giving rise to an extraordinary amount of intolerance in public debate. And I am pleased that MPs like Ian Austin are recognising that there is this profound problem in the Labour Party that needs to be dealt with. Otherwise, these people will just go further and further in turning politics into this kind of PC nightmare in which people with different views can't express themselves.
Extraordinary stuff, very much reflected in our political debate in this country as well. Brendan, thanks so much for talking to us again. Always a pleasure to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Chris.